Hey guys, and welcome to my round 1 recap of the 2022 Tata Steel Masters tournament. Those who are wondering about the title, well, that's because many of the world's top players blew winning positions against their opponents, and that's where we're going to start with our recap, seeing how those top players could have won instead of not winning. So let's get to our first game, which was played between Esipenko against Magnus Carlsen. You may recall that a year ago, Esipenko was white against Carlsen. They had a Night-Off Sicilian, and that Esipenko just completely murdered Magnus Carlsen in the game. Carlsen didn't really have much of a chance and lost without a fight. So, of course, Carlsen was very determined to try to get some revenge and get closer to his big dream of breaking 2900 ELO, right? So, the game went d4, and actually it was an opening that I have covered in quite a few videos on this YouTube channel in the past. e6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3. And now the semi-Slav with c6, which has not been one of Carlsen's main choice in recent games, but is the main line. By the way, if you are enjoying this video, make sure to smash that like button and definitely subscribe to the channel. It's the easiest way to improve your chess. Now, the game saw queen c2, and here Carlsen didn't play the usual bishop d6 main lines, but instead he went for this shortcut of b6, which granted is maybe not quite as strong as the move bishop to d6, but it's also quite a solid move to fianchetto and also quite playable, right? So after some normal developing moves by both sides, this is where Carlsen decides to play it a little bit differently to usual. If the bishop is on e2, you normally see moves like rook queen e7, rook's in the center, prepare a c5 or e5 push is the general idea. With the bishop on d3, Carlsen realized it's a slightly better version for white, which is kind of the reason why 6b6 is considered very marginally imprecise. But still, with the move c5, black is able to get some tension in the center, right? And after c takes d5, e takes d5, well, it's very likely that at some point we're going to have d takes c5, bc5, and the hanging pawn structure. Granted, the engine considers white to have a small edge in these sorts of positions, as, for example, the bishop is a little bit passive, and when you have d5, bc5, those hang pawns can become a weakness, but it's a sharp position where the better player is very likely to win. Computer likes bishop f5, by the way, with the idea that if g6, you kind of run the bishop away and you have this kind of annoying pin. Well, at least if black plays rook c8 to put the rook opposite the queen, well, the pin can be a little bit annoying in that case, right? So that would have been a way for white to prove an advantage, but instead we had a more quiet development with rook fd1, rook e8. Keep in mind, by the way, that this is the first classical game by these players in some time. Carlsen's last one was the World Championship match against Nepomniachtchi. So perhaps the players are still shaking off a little bit of rust in terms of classical chess, you know, with COVID and all that. So bishop f5, the idea of a6, if you're wondering, is just to stop any knight b5 moves. So rook c8. And the thing is, in these structures, if white waits too long to play d takes c5, let's say, for argument's sake, he plays some random move like h3 or g3, for example. Well, in this case, black can consider moves such as c4 at some point and start to push his queenside majority forward, kind of leaving the d-pawn passed by, as it were. So white plays dc5 to avoid that, and also saying that, well, if you don't take with the pawn, you've got an isolated pawn on d5 that is kind of passive. But after bc5, I think that this position is ultimately quite reasonable, and that Carlsen has come out of the opening with equality. So knight a4 tries to pressure the black with some pieces, but actually it turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. Where in this position, well, when it comes to hanging pawn positions, what do you think is the dream pawn break for black in these kind of structures, in the ideal kind of world? Yeah, of course, if you're, let's say, have any experience in these structures, you'll know that d4 is a move that is crying out to be played, in principle. Probably Carlsen didn't play it because he realized that, well, maybe it's a pawn sack. Like, if e takes d4, for example, then, you know, okay, in that case, black can play bishop takes f3, and it turns out that the white king is very, very exposed, which is a lot more important than the fact that white is up a pawn here. In fact, if you just go knight d5 and just play for mate with queen h4, there's not a lot white can really do about it. yeah, take all the pawns you want. If you get mate, it's not going to help you. You can't take the pawns with you to the grave so easily, right? Or at least there's not much point in doing so. So that was the first opportunity that Carlsen missed. D4 would have given a very nice advantage in this position, and it's kind of surprising to me that Esipenko didn't play some more solid move in the position. You know, for example, knight b1 would be one idea. Although even then, d4 is still a move. I guess knight g5 avoids the d4 idea, but it's still, you know, the knights and bishop going to get kicked around. It's not a perfect solution either, right? So after knight a4, black goes rook c7, and now after white's move bishop c3, which is a big mistake, by the way. White really should get this queen off the c file of the rook, because when the rook is opposite the queen, it creates all kinds of tactical opportunities, and this position is just a very, very good example. Now, before I show you the opportunity that Carlsen missed here, which would actually give him a decisive advantage, let me show you what actually happened in the game. Now, in the game, black played the move queen to e7, and it ultimately ended in a repetition with the moves bishop to a5, rook c6. The bishop is not doing a lot on a5, right? So bishop to c3. Black plays rook to c7. And this is how the game ended, just with a repetition of moves like this. So perhaps not the way to show your fighting spirit, but I guess Carlsen felt, okay, draw with black is a okay result in the first round, and we'll, you know, try to push with white in the next game in round 2. At least I assume he's playing with the white pieces. I know that one of the plays does start with 2 blacks. I'm not sure if that's Carlsen or somebody else, but anyway, the point is that black missed a much greater opportunity, but it does require a little bit of courage to consider this idea. Now, maybe there are some of you watching this who are thinking, oh, it's easy, just d4, bishop f3, and you just win. But the thing is that white has the move bishop a5, actually winning the exchange, and I think that this is what Carlsen was worried about, because, I mean, any player 1600 plus would see d4 in 30 seconds maximum. But it's one thing to see it and another to actually calculate it. So, like, after bishop takes f3, and again, I remind you, this is not what happened in the game, this is just an analysis, but it turns out that, again, if you don't find exactly the right move here as black, you don't really get compensation for the exchange, and it reminds me a little bit of a game in the world, Rapid, I believe it was, between Carlsen against Grishuk, or rather Grishuk-Carlsen, where Carlsen blundered an exchange but still managed to hold the draw. But here you've got to see knight e5. If you don't play knight e5, white will just take everything and you just have nothing. But the point now is that if white does play bishop takes c7, we can play the move knight takes f3. And, I mean, king f1, queen c7, I mean, you've got an exchange less, but you've got a pawn and you have a massive attack on the king. I think you don't need to be a genius to realize that this is very good for black. But king g2 is a bit trickier looking because of the attack on the knight. And here, it's kind of somewhat important to see the move of queen a8. Okay, to be fair, queen a8 is not the only winning move. You do also have the move knight h4, but here as well you kind of have to see that after a move like king h3, that, you know, in this position, that the lines with queen c7 are still winning in case you go down this line. That if white does, you know, take the knight, then we have a very difficult computer move here. Well, okay, technically there are several winning moves, but the one that kind of is the real knockout is queen c6. And just this deadly quiet move, we're just going to play queen at g2 and threaten queen takes h2 and also g5 mate. And there's just not a lot white can really do to stop it, because if you play rook g1, for example, just queen f3 and you're threatening queen h5 mate, and, you know, you're also, you know, if rook g5 to cover it, there's h6, and suddenly white is just not able to defend this king on h4 anymore. So it's a very difficult line to see, and I think it's not that big of a shock that neither of the players saw it, because it's quite difficult, but it's a quite instructive point as to how the attack plays out, right? Now, as for queen a8, if you're wondering why this move works, the first point is that white is not in time to grab material with bishop takes h6, because knight h4 is actually a forced mate. So that is, if the king runs this way, you know, queen g2, g5, we saw this already, yes or yes. But if king f1, we go queen g2, and we mate in a couple of moves. If king e1, we can actually play either rook takes e3 or knight f3. You know, kind of the more fun line is, I guess, the rook e3, rook sack. And doing it like this, where fe3, knight e3 is a extremely beautiful and exquisite even checkmate here. So, as you can see, like, of course, white's not forced to take the bishop, but otherwise, how are you dealing with this? If you try to block diagonal with e4, then black just goes knight h4, and it just turns out that even though black is a rook down, that this attack with the queen and the two knights is, and the other piece is just too much. You know, if white plays bishop takes d6, the idea is not to play knight takes d6, but there's a very beautiful move here of, well, actually there's more than one winning move technically, but the move knight to g5 is, you know, one way to kind of set up these beautiful mating patterns like queen to g2. You know, knight g5 are also covering bishop h3, right? And, you know, if they play like f4 or f3, then, you know, you just take and yeah, knights just dance everywhere. Like knight d2, just very beautiful engine-like ideas that you're threatening queen g2 mate, which is white and on time to take the knight. But if rook g1, you've got queen f3 mate, and, well, white has to give back all his material and more, and still probably gets mated most likely anyway. Engine says mate in 12 in case you're curious. So this is a very beautiful sequence, I think a very instructive one, but of course we also have some other games to look at, so let's do that. Now, this game between Caruana against Karyakin, let's look at it from the white perspective. I don't think a whole lot happened in this game, but let's flick through it really quickly just to see if there were any big moments. So d5, and I think the idea of Caruana's cd5 versus a normal knight c3 is that probably he wants to avoid some lines such as c5 and cd4, which have a reputation of just being very, very solid for black and very hard for white to prove a serious advantage. So cd5, I guess, is an attempt to avoid that and saying that, okay, if you play semi-Slav style with c6, which is what happened in the game, well, I just go bishop f4 and, you know, we play chess. So bishop f6 was played. Computer likes to go bishop f5 and not let white take the diagonal, but okay, bishop b6, of course, is quite solid as well. Take, e3. And after castles, because I think Caruana's idea of bishop f5 is that he wants to go knight h4 and try to force the bishop off the diagonal and maybe put the knight into f5. It's an interesting idea for one game at the very least. So Karyakin castles instead. But after queen c2, I kind of feel like white might have a tiny something in this position. Because bishop g4 is, you know, the engine's move, but knight e5 and you get a good sort of Pillsbury kind of setup in that case. With a pawn f4 to follow, as it were. So black goes b6 and I guess wants to prepare a c5 break, but I do think that Caruana did get a pretty nice position out of the opening. So g6, bishop d3. And yeah, bishop a6 is trying to be creative and trade off the bishops, but I don't really have that high of an opinion of it. I think after take castles, the knight is a bit misplaced on a6 ultimately, and, you know, white has a pretty serious advantage in my opinion. In fact, if black played c5, you could even potentially get a position like this with a similar structure to the Carlsen Esipenko game, but where the exchange of those bishops really plays in white's favour, and making it easier for white to attack those pawns later in the game with the pieces, or indeed with the pawns. So black goes rook fc8, white goes rook fd1, you know, rook opposite the queen can't be a bad idea, even if computer prefers to go for knight e5 and the Pillsbury plan instead. So knight c7 is played, a3, but these are all pretty solid moves by both sides. I mean, I don't think white's played in an absolutely perfect way, but still, you know, it's a normal structure where white can probably claim a small edge, and, well, now he realized that it's a good time to play knight to e5. If the queen's on d6, you might have c5, and you could try to pressure d4, but with the queen having moved to e7 voluntarily, this is not really feasible. And it does feel like Caruana somewhat outplays Karyakin in this sort of middle game. So queen e2 is played. Knight e8 is, I guess, trying to get the knight towards here and maybe kick the knight with f6. But f6 is also quite a weakening move at the same time. Like, you are opening your king quite a lot, and, you know, it also leaves you vulnerable to things like queen g4, maybe e4 opening the center. And, I mean, black is definitely struggling here, right? In a position like this, for example. So, white just has too many ideas in a sense. This is probably why black goes a6 instead. Trying perhaps to hold back the whole b4 plan, a4, b5 minority attack. But h4, this move by Caruana shows you can also hit on this flank as well and try to create some weaknesses. Black goes h5 to stop that, but now we see another problem that you can't play f6 to kick the knight anymore, because then the g6 pawn is hanging, and it's these little subtle differences that make the difference between, let's say, the super grandmasters and the other players in terms of getting these principles quickly and applying them, of course, in the game. So king g7 is played. White retreats with knight f3, which actually, this is the moment where I would say Caruana missed his best chance to win. If you find the right move here as white, I think it's pretty much game over. So in tribute to our theme for this video of blowing winning positions, how could white have played instead to get a decisive advantage? And I'll give you a hint that you're trying to attack the black king. So here white has a very strong pawn sack in the move f4. And the idea of f4 is that you are wanting to play f5 and just rip open that black king, because once you break that pawn chain, then, you know, it all just melts like butter on the king's side. But if black were to play a move like knight takes f4 instead, trying to avoid this f5 and queen h5 kind of business, well, queen e3, knight e6, and what we see after rook f1 is that black is just not really able to defend this pawn in a good way. You see, if black plays a move such as knight to d6 trying to defend it, if rook c7, white would probably just go g4 and just rip open the king this way. It's complicated, but a computer says that it's winning for white to play like this. But if black goes knight d6 and tries to defend with a less valuable piece, which is generally a good strategic principle, the problem is that white can just play e takes d5 and win the pawn back with interest, with a nice little remove the defender tactic. Knight takes f7, and then the point is after knight f7 that now the knight on e6 is no longer defended. Not only that, but also queen f6 forks all of the kingside pieces. The d5 pawn is on pre, and so white is completely and utterly winning at this point. But Caruana didn't see this, and in the end, after knight f3, somehow the opportunity was gone, yeah? And after e5 and knight g4, you know, suddenly white's edge is not so great anymore. Okay, computer says even here, like knight g5 and kicking this knight is still much better for white, but it's not a decisive advantage, let's say, to play it like this. White is trying to go queen d2 instead in the game, which, you know, does give black some time to try to do something, like a move like c5, for example. Trying to open up the center would have been quite a good idea at this point. You know, it's best not to stew in your own juices when you have the space disadvantage and some problem pieces. But black goes a5 instead, and well, now, as we saw before, knight g5 is a very good move, and it is the move that Caruana played. We had take, queen to d7. And now I played knight to e2, another very good maneuver, with the point that, you know, you're ready to go knight e6, knight f4, and, you know, again, try to attack some of these weaknesses on the king side, in case black's pieces go wandering about on the queen side too much. Because black has several weaknesses, like the king is weak, but also c6 is weak here. And after rook a3, it's another position where we can say that technically white is winning at this point. The way that the computer wants to do it is it wants to play the move rook e1, with the idea that when you take, you want to be able to go knight f4 and then use the rook to support the e6 break. So it's kind of like a preparation for e6, but also saying that, you know, if they do play a move like fe6 trying to keep that e-file closed, well, in that case you have queen g5, and it just turns out that the ending is just winning for white strategically, because this pawn is very weak. At some moment you have to watch out for f3. Okay, now black has knight e3, but in a later position, if the rook isn't on a3, then the knight might simply be lost. And all of these weaknesses just kind of accumulate to black just being completely strategically busted here. You know, even a move like b5 and hitting the c6 weakness this way is a problem as well. But instead of going for this, Caruana played rook to c2. And after this, I mean, white is still much better even here, to be fair. And you have rook dc1, c5. Okay, black is realizing that position is kind of bad and is trying to change it up. But still, it's a little bit surprising to me, I guess, that, well, maybe time trouble was a factor. Maybe this is why Caruana didn't find the winning continuation here. What white should have done is he should have taken with the b pawn. And then after b takes, played the move knight takes e6. And I'm guessing the reason that Caruana didn't do this is after fe6, he was nervous about the counterplay with queen h4 and the attack on the king. But if you throw in the intermediate move f3, it just amounts to nothing for black. It looks scary to have the knight in your face, but after rook c5 takes. And now a very important move of d takes c5. So rook c5, queen h4 wouldn't really lead anywhere. It would only be a perpetual. But once you get the pass pawn, this is what is the clincher. And if queen takes h4, knight d4, we see that while the material is equal, white is actually completely dominating this position, right? You know, knight e6 is a threat. And if queen e7, you've got moves like queen b2 even, where you attack the rook, where this pawn is running down the board, and somehow black is just not really in a position to cover it, right? You know, if you play, let's say, rook a4 or rook a7, the idea of rook a7 is to try to stop c6, queen b7, but even here, c6 is still winning, and, okay, if you're a computer, you'll see that queen f2 and kicking knight and then going for knight c6 is even better. The immediate knight c6 wouldn't be winning immediately, because black would have the move queen to b7, and okay, it's still a completely winning position, so I guess, well, we can see that the black just doesn't have any way to save himself on a tactical level here, right? But instead of playing this, white goes dc5, and the difference here is after bc5, bc5, well, black goes knight takes g5 and just wins back the pawn simply, because if you play queen g5, black will still take back the pawn just with the knight instead. But after hg5 now it's just equal, and, well, I think the game didn't really steer away from this balance where, you know, the passed pawns kind of cancel themselves out in terms of the evaluation of the position, and once the knight got to c4, it became pretty obvious that this was going to be a draw. Just to show final moves quickly, knight b5, rook a6. Knight c3 is not blundering the pawn, because rook c5, we have knight d5, and okay, white is down a pawn technically, but, you know, with the 2 versus 3 is just a very ironclad draw as such. So take, and, you know, the players just shuffled a bit. Rook c5. I mean, it doesn't affect the evaluation of the position, but after a few not so meaningful moves, the game did end in a draw. At this point, you know, is where Kayakin realized he was wasting his time trying to win when, you know, when white's got 2 pawns to black's 3 on one side. So this was this game, and I think quite an instructive one. Definitely Caruana missed some big winning opportunities. But, yeah, well, the game ended in a draw because of that. The next game I want to share with you is another game that was played in the round 1 of the Tata Steel Masters. This was played between Anish Giri against the sort of surprise pack of the tournament, Pragnananda, who I'm trying to remember actually how he qualified. I think he might have qualified for this event via some other event. I forgot the exact details. Or it could have just been invited by the organizers. But this sort of English line with G6 and G3 and C6 is kind of like a reversed Alapin. The argument black is making that if you compare this position to, you know, the Alapin Sicilian, you know, with E4, C5, C3, well, the difference is that white has this extra move at G3, which, yeah, it looks useful to develop the bishop, but it also wouldn't normally be the move you would play if you're playing the Alapin as black, right? You know, you'd play more directly in the center like D3 and this sort of thing. And actually, D3 is also quite a decent move in this position, by the way, if you like to have a lot of tension in the center, because if black exchanges, it tends to work out in white's favor. But Giri instead played the normal c takes d5 and said, okay, you get in queen d5, but I get to kick your queen away with knight c3 later. Game went knight f6, knight c3, queen e5. These are all pretty natural moves. You know, the idea of queen e5 being to make sure that our pawn is well defended. Knight a6, another move that, you know, might look a bit funny, but actually makes a lot of sense to, well, A, stop white going b4 and trying to hit the queen this way, and B, you know, maybe the knight can come to defend a pawn if needed. But here, Giri comes up with a quite original idea. You see, if you play a move like d4, which is kind of the obvious move, then black will simply take, and this structure is one that, of course, is a very thematic structure, you know, with the imbalance in the structure. Definitely, there is scope for either side to play for a win. Just objectively, it doesn't really give any real advantage for white. You know, whether you play rook c1 or go e4, you know, black has got counterplay on with his active pieces in many lines. So Giri decides to play a little bit differently and play the move knight e1, which is quite obviously something he prepared for the game. And yeah, it's not the move that is the first line of the computer, but it's a little bit positionally tricky in that you're not just keeping the option open of playing d4 and taking with the knight to maybe have a more harmonious position and after queen takes, but in some lines you can also play the move f3 and try to attack this way, and that's actually what happened in the game, where instead of, you know, playing a move such as, let's say, bishop f5 and, you know, playing this structure, saying that, okay, you got this kind of French-style structure, but my pawn is kind of killing your bishop and your knight, you know, would lead to a very interesting battle, and I think it makes sense that, you know, Giri had prepared this quite deeply at home, of course, like f3 and with a very, you know, unbalanced structure with the hanging pawns, which is almost a sub-theme for this video. But in the game, Pragu played the move knight b4 instead, trying to hold back d4. And the other point is that if white plays a3, then black's knight simply goes to a better square on d5, yes or yes, and the pressure means it's not so easy to get in b4 or d3 in a good version, as it were. However, Giri had another move up his sleeve, and I mentioned this idea to you before, that the move f3 is a little bit unpleasant. And from here, Giri quickly manages to get a strong attack in what is his first classical game of 2022 as well. E to f3, knight f3. And, well, computer says that in the earlier position of queen c5 was better than ef3, but now white has to move d4 in reply. It doesn't make a lot of sense to move the queen here. Still queen h5 and going for this strikes me as a little bit optimistic somehow. And with d4, white is now suddenly moving that center forward, having a very nice dynamic position with these half-open files to go with the central majority. By the way, another interesting point about Anish Giri is that he actually has reached the playoff stage of the Wijk Aan Zee tournament twice. You know, he's tied for first. One case with Carlsen, another case with Jordan van Foreest in 2018 and 2021 respectively. Unfortunately, he lost both the playoffs, so obviously he wants to, you know, train things here. And computer says, well, just develop your queen, like queen b3, prepare e4 at some stage is what it wants to do. But Giri decides to be very direct and just play e4 immediately. And it is a pawn sacrifice, but it's a quite appealing pawn sac. And definitely on a practical level is quite a dangerous continuation for black, right? Because after white's next move of rook to e1, well, suddenly you have the pin and it's not so easy for black to get castled, right? So the only move for black is the one Pragnananda played with f5. And white goes queen f3 to keep the king in the center. And has to be said that Pragnananda defended very well for this point, where the move queen f7 is a very important idea to exchange the queens before that e-file gets opened, or, you know, some knight e5 stops queen f7. But after this, okay, here white does indeed exchange the queens so that he can get his pawn back with knight to e5. But in the arising battle, black is sort of able to consolidate a little bit, where after the game's bishop takes e4, it's not absolutely forced to take, but if you don't take, I mean, black's kind of solid with the knight here, yes or yes. But now we see that after rook e4 to bishop f5, that black is getting the bishop out and at least is catching up in development, yeah? For some reason, my stockfish is misbehaving a lot, so if I appear to suddenly be teleporting from one pace to another instantaneously, this is the reason why. So at this point, this is maybe the last moment where white could try to eke something out of the position. I think here it's kind of important to play somewhat aggressively before black can, let's say, just go in an opposite colored bishop position and have a pretty safe draw. So if I was white, I would probably go rook f4, and the idea of rook f4 is that after rook f8, that you can go a4 and basically trade off this bishop so that you get a good knight versus bad bishop position. And okay, it's not enough to win. I mean, black can go h5 and, you know, swap rook h6. I mean, black is probably not going to lose this, but this is maybe the last chance white has to still play for a win. You know, if you get like a5 and h4, I mean, you are at least fixing these pawns on the light squares, which, you know, gives you some hope to play on the dark squares, conversely. So instead, the game went rook e1, and, well, now black was able to kind of hold with bishop f6. Because, again, if these opposite colored bishops happen, it will be quite hard for white to manifest his current initiative into anything more special. So he goes knight c4, wanting to keep a few more pieces on the board. But knight c4 is also a loss of time, and after b6, this is just to make sure knight d6 is not a fork, simply. Bishop f4, h5 was played, so making a little hidey hole for h7 for the king. Knight d6, bishop to g6 is played, and okay, after knight e4, just the rising ending is just very, very equal at the end of the day. You know, white's extra space doesn't really mean anything when a lot of pieces already traded, right? And so the game ended rook a1, rook a to d8 was played. In fact, to me, it's maybe black who could fight for an advantage, but Giri was able to maintain the balance. Rook h8, and I mean, once you get a rook ending like this, I mean, even, you know, an extra pawn is often not enough to win in a rook ending, and the fact black has a slightly better pawn structure, like we're trying to attack these pawns, it's just not enough, realistically. So game ended rook e2, c5, king e3, cd, cd, king e6, king d3. So the place for putting the kings in the center, as one would expect for the ending. f5, a4, rook a5. And okay, it's true that rook a4 is not a real threat, because rook takes f5, but yeah, a6, king b4, and it's just very, very equal, and we end up with a repetition of moves: rook f2, king e6, rook e2, king d7, rook f2, and yeah, draw was agreed. So it's a game that, is quite a balanced one. Giri did have a little bit of an edge out of the opening, but his e4 pawn sack, while it was very inspired, it sort of, just didn't really lead to a long-term initiative after Pragnananda's good defense, and so probably a bit more of a patient preparation of e4 would have given a much bigger advantage by comparison. So having looked at this game, I will show you another game. This one also ended in a draw, and I think there wasn't that much content to it. It was more of a theoretical sort of game, but let's have a quick look, just because if you're really struggling to find a good system against a semi-Slav, I think this game will give you a little bit of inspiration, potentially, if you're looking for some lazy shortcut. Because after e6 in this position, it's kind of interesting as an alternative to the e3 of Esipenko, Carlsen, or the mainline bishop g5. The move of... or actually, if white goes cd5, it's kind of funny, because it could actually transpose into the Caruana kayaking game we saw earlier, funnily enough, with bishop f4 and so on. But g3 is kind of an interesting alternative. It's not like it gives an advantage or anything, but the idea is you play this sort of quasi-Catalan, where, your knight is on c3, but their pawn is also on c6 as kind of the trade-off. So black goes b5, this is how the game went, with knight e5, and now the move a6 is actually the main line in this position, because if you play queen b6 instead, sometimes you get hit with some a4, a5 later on in the game, say after you've castled first, and it's just slightly annoying on a practical level, even though the computer thinks it's fine. So the idea of a6 is saying that you're actually not really worried if they take the pawn back, because while white is taking the pawn, he's losing a lot of time moving the knight, yes or yes. And so after, let's say, knight b8, and even, if you really want to show off, even bishop to b7 is possible, but, rook b8 and first is good enough, and this is just an equal position, not really a lot going on at this point. White as a center, but black's got the development and the queen side in return, so that's why Dubov instead castles and plays it more as a pawn sacrifice, with bishop b7 and now the main line in modern times of b3. And b3 is a very Dubov-esque pawn sacrifice that is seen a lot in the Catalan type positions, that if c takes b3, well, either you play a takes b3 and say that, you've got some pressure on the bishop, or the line is sort of the other fun approach is to go queen takes b3, and sort of sacrifice the second pawn, but say that you get a nice lead in development with bishop f4 and rook d1, and okay, computer says that you can survive here with queen b4, but white does have a pretty nice lead in development, and after queen c2, it's not that easy to actually develop the queen side, because knight d7 you're running in a knight c6 at different times, and black has to be quite precise in order to hold at this point. So that's why Mamadjarov instead plays b4, which is a much more dynamic approach to the position, saying an after knight a4, which it's not the only move, but it is the main move in the position. And moves like bc4, these piece sacks exist, but they are a little bit speculative, admittedly. Probably it's not really something you'd play except as maybe a surprise weapon in blitz. But knight a4, is kind of a standard move, and after c3, well, black gets a protected passed pawn. And normally white goes a3 and tries to undermine it in this way, but Dubov decides to first play knight c4, maybe hoping to surprise his opponent, but Shark just handled it very well, a5, a3. And now bishop a6 is a very precise move here, with the idea that you're sort of blocking the a file for one thing, and also you kind of have the option to take this knight at some point if you need to deal with the pressure. After bishop f4, this is what white did in the game, but that also allows black to go bishop b5, and suddenly, if black is able to take this knight, then, you don't get knight c5 in to use that outpost, and so suddenly the position is not so easy, and maybe white's best bet is to play a b4 and knight c5 anyway at this point. Black can take in different ways, like rook takes a1, for example. But ultimately, white should have enough compensation to hold in such a position like this. You've got d6 for the knight, and the pawn on c3 is kind of kept under tab, so, it's not a lot of fun, but it should be holdable for white. These sort of like semi-sound sacrifice are very typical Dubov, The move e4, doesn't really have as good an impression to my mind, and I think after bishop e7, knight a b6 and rook to a6, that black was simply much better in the game. Although it is true that Shark did maybe miss a little bit of an opportunity where, a4 is really the only way to try to avoid giving up more material. I mean, you could even just play bishop takes c4, and I think, honestly, with such a monster pass pawn c3, and the extra pawn is way more important than white's center and bishops, and I think that, if you kind of untangle with something like knight d7, knight b6, and prepare c5, I think it's very, very likely that black would win from this position. At the very least, it's a clear advantage. But instead of that, we have rook takes b6, which, to be fair, is also very good. After knight b6, there's bishop f1, taking the rook and winning a piece. So a takes b5, rook takes b5, and, well, black is up 2 pawns, which is quite nice, though it is true white has a little more compensation with the pressure against the a pawn, I suppose. And the game went castles, queen a1. And after queen a1, this is where Shark took the pawn with queen d4, which is a very good decision. Just take the pawn, and then it just becomes a matter of neutralizing the white initiative, with these active pieces. And after knight takes a5, Shark continues to play very, very precise moves. Bishop c5 again, an incredibly good move in this position. Not fearing discovered attacks like knight takes c6, for example. Well, this is what Dubov played in the game, actually, to hit these guys at once. But then bishop f2 is a beautiful counterattack. The point being that if rook takes f2, that black can simply take the knight. Now the rook is no longer hitting the queen. Black is just up 2 pawns for nothing, and is winning with this monster pass pawn. So white goes king h1 and queen b6. So far, Shark has played a virtually flawless game. But the position is still a little bit tricky to actually win, and with the move e5, Dubov is trying to make it as difficult as possible for white. However, I think that if Shark had now played the correct move, and this is where it really fits with the theme of this video of blowing winning positions, well, knight d5 was the key here. The point being, if white goes bishop d6 to get out of this attack, well, black can simply play bishop c5, yeah? And even though the material is equal after this, with the knight and 2 pawns for the exchange, the reality is that black is just completely crushing. I mean, white's bishop is kind of stupid on g2, quite frankly, but you kind of need it to defend the king. Black has a very straightforward plan of winning the e5 pawn as, well, with the opposite card bishops, white can't really defend the dark squares, yes or yes. And so strategically, this is just completely lost for white, and I think if you play around the position for a moment, you'll come to the same conclusion as the engine. But black goes knight e4 instead, which is not as simple anymore, because it's still winning, but the pin makes it a bit more difficult from a human perspective. For example, here you have to find this very precise move of bishop to e3, which, surprise, surprise, Shark did not find in the game. And the point is that after bishop takes f8, that you're not taking back the bishop on f8, which would actually be, only 0-0-0, or actually even losing for black. But the move c2 is the key. And the idea is that now white's not in time to go rook to d8 in this position, because now we have knight f2 and we're able to, do some funky stuff with the knight. Well, let me show you it on the board. So the idea is you have knight f2, and then, you're able to promote with a check, which is a very important point in this position. So that bishop e7, say, is not mate. And if white goes rook e1 instead, well, yeah, now it's a different story. That black is able to take the bishop. And even though you have all this crisscross of pins, the fact that this pawn is threatening the queen if white takes the bishop means that this is actually just a winning position for black. And if white, let's say, goes rook c2 and tries to, create some counterattack on the king like this. I mean, after bishop takes e4, it turns out that, just queen c7 and the attack just doesn't go anywhere. Because rook e3 runs into queen c1 and you win the rook with the fork on king and bishop, and otherwise, you're just winning pawns and white's king is just too exposed. And did I mention he's already down the pawn to begin with? So that would have been a way for Mamadrov to close out the game and to secure a winning position. What he did instead is he played the move rook to d8. Now after rook d8, white played the move rook e2, and this move basically allowed white to save the game. As after f5, white was able to play the move en passant, and, well, you know the meme, if en passant is legal, you got to do it. But more seriously, after c2, white found a very nice tactical move of f7, just, forcing the king into the pinning position with rook f1, and given that white is basically getting back his material that he sacrificed, the game was agreed drawn at this point. To give an example, after rook f1, c1 equals queen. Well, black gets 2 queens for the moment, but after rook c1, queen d6, yeah, I mean, black is up a pawn, but white has got absolutely enough counterplay against the king here. After something like bishop d4, queen b1, it's ultimately just a balanced position. White's got enough activity, let's say, with, rook c6, and, the activity compensates for the pawn deficit as such. So this was quite a fun game, and I think you'll agree that even though all 4 of these games were draws, they all had a lot of content, a lot of very nice instructional points of how to actually convert a winning position into a win, and to not mess up the way these top players in the world have been doing in these 4 games so far. Okay, to be fair, Guri wasn't actually winning against Pragu, but he did have a pretty big advantage in the early middle game. So now we get to actually see a few decisive games from Tata Steel, and we get to see who the leaders are after round 1 of the event. Now, our first game features a very interesting structure and a very interesting matchup as well between Polish number 1 Jan Krzysztof Duda against Hungarian number 1 Richard Rapport. And after this, we have a London with Bishop f4. And yeah, in the old days, people used to play it with e3 and just develop automatically. But at a higher level, the main trend is to go c4. And I used to play to move queen b3 and try to attack this pawn. This was popular in 2021. But Duda decides to go e3 instead, saying, alright, if you want to, you can just play bishop takes b1. And, well, white loses the right to castle because, knight d2, knight e1 is e4 is a pretty nasty pin. But white also makes the argument that, okay, my king is not that badly placed in the center, and if you go dc4, I can go queen a4, and I can try to, set some problems with this pin. And, okay, it's kind of sharp, but, white's saying that his position is more solid. And if black isn't able to use his dynamic trumps, then, white's long-term advantages will give him an edge. Computer says 0, 0, 0, but as you can imagine, it's a pretty chaotic line. Where at the top level, of course, I analyze this almost to death with the engine. But Rapport is a more creative type of player, and he decides to play knight bd7, trying to keep a little more flexibility in the position. But it's a bit imprecise to do this because of the move queen b3 as Duda played. And now white gets a little bit of a small advantage. So black plays bishop to d6. Computer wants to go a5 and just ignore everything, but let's not care what the computer says. And I guess Duda felt that the structure after, say, bishop takes and knight c3, which is the suggestion of computer, by the way, because, queen b7, rook b8 is giving black a bit too big a lead in development. Probably Duda felt that his sort of position would just be a little bit too symmetrical. Of course, I mean to play bishop c4, not queen c4, but, this position is kind of solid for black. You can play even a move like queen b6, for example, or knight b6, and it's just very hard to turn this into a more tangible advantage for white, as black is just very, very solid. It's quite normal moves to play from here. So Duda plays bishop g3, objectively not maybe the top move, but it allows to keep a bit more tension between the bishops, a bit more play in the position. And it pays off because rather than just castling and, just playing for solid equality, Rapport tries to unbalance things with d takes c4 and then the move rook to b8 defending the pawn. But it strikes me as being a bit of an imprecise approach, and I think that in the game after knight c3, so black played a move b5, which is not necessarily a mistake, but it is a little bit double-edged to play like this. The pawn can become a little bit of a weakness if you don't get in c5 at some point. So we have castles and, rook d1 again showing Duda's very creative style, because the normal move would just be to castle and just develop normally, rook's in the center. But then black is able to, for example, play take, and c5, and, he's able to hit back in the center, and in general, if you get in c5 and queen's gambit, you're not really going to be worse in principle. Although this position might be an exception, like maybe white can go a4 or dc5 and still have some small pull, but, this was, I guess, Duda's logic. They didn't want to give black an easy c5 break, and so by playing rook d1, and again, a common theme from these games, putting the rook opposite the queen, we see that now it's too late to go c5 because, well, in this case, white can simply take it, yeah? And, you're not getting a knight takes c5 anymore because of the pin, which is kind of important. So instead, Rapport decides to play the move queen to e7, which is definitely a very solid move. And again, something like castle, take, g5 is just, c5 is going to be about equal. So Duda plays knight e5, trying to keep some unbalance in the position, keep some play going, to which Rapport in turn plays the move b4, attacking the knight, and saying, well, you're not in time to go knight c6, because if you play knight c6, well, black can then play this very beautiful idea. It's a very deep combination of b takes c3, so actually not a Botez gambit, but the idea is that you actually get more than enough compensation because queen c3, bishop b4 wins the queen with the pin, so that's a disadvantage you're not castling. But if you move the queen away, then black just goes cb2 and suddenly... Well, actually, instead of cb2, actually c2 is even better. And somehow, like, the two pieces and this monster pass pawn are better than the queen. It's just absolutely incredible, this sort of queen sack. But so, realizing that, Duda just plays knight to a4, trying to, I guess, cut the losses a bit and keep them in the equilibrium. We have bishop takes e5. Obviously not knight e5, because then the fork will win a piece after de5. So bishop e5 avoids that problem. d5, knight e4. And after f3, we get this very funny kind of structure, actually, after takes, you know, with two sets of doubled pawns. But at the same time, the double pawns are also opening up the files for the rooks, right? And if black plays knight e5, which is kind of the obvious question, then white's idea is that after e4, bishop to g6, and now a very nice move, queen to e3, just preparing to put the knight into c5. Well, I mean, white does have full positional compensation because of the weaknesses on the queen side and black's bad minor pieces. Now, is it enough for an advantage? I would say no, that it's still about equal, but, you know, I think that this is still would have been a good way for black to play it. The move in the game, knight c5, is also fine and does also keep the balance, and it leads to a very similar kind of situation, if you like, where, you know, black is grabbing a pawn, but white has got good long-term strategic compensation due to a weakness of black's pawns. So rook d7 was played. Black played a5, just making sure the pawns are all safe and defended by the queen. Rook hd1, so taking control of the open file. h5 is played. Yeah, h5 might look a little bit weird, but you are making look for the king, and I mean, you never know when you'll have g5 and potential counterplay on a white king, right? So it's a useful idea. We had e4, bishop to g6, rook 1, d2, so at this point, both sides have been playing very, very well, and also the move h4 is a very spirited attempt by Report to give back the pawn, but on the other hand, to, you know, get it back and, you know, create some problems for the white king, as it were. Well, maybe not problems, but at least to be a little bit annoying. So bishop f1 is played, queen takes h4, and the idea of bishop f1 is to play g3, and so if queen h2'd it, you can block the checks with bishop to g2, which maybe is still the best way to play the position, but black does have to be a little bit precise in how he coordinates the pieces from here, yeah? So after queen to h5, this was a move that Report played, maybe going for some queen to c5 and saying that, you know, if white takes the pawn, you know, rook c8 and black just gets counterplay down the c file and you're not really getting any advantage as white. In fact, even a move like, let's say, f5 could also be an idea to try to open up the white king in this way for counterplay. In any case, it's clear that black is not worse in such a position, and, well, queen e3 in the game instead tries to keep a bit more play, keep a bit more tension as such. And it paid off, because here is where Report started to make some mistakes, with possibly the time pressure being a factor. So what I would recommend that black plays in this position is to play the move f5. And I know, you know, if they try to block with e5, you go f4 and you rip open the king, but if they play e takes f5, then, well, which way would you take back on f5 in this position? I think it's actually best to take back with the rook. Even though you let them take a pawn e6 with check, the point is that you're getting threats as well against their king. In fact, maybe white's king is even more exposed than black's at this point. You know, after bishop g2, rook e8, and queen c4, well, it turns out that black has enough piece activity, and actually you even have a way to force a draw if you want to as black here, according to the computer. It's not the only move, like c5 is perfectly fine as well, but it's kind of cool that you can play rook takes f3, sacrifice the rook, but then go queen h2, and just have a repetition with something like, let's say, either king f1, queen g3, and, you know, somehow the white king is just a bit too exposed to, you know, get out of all the checks. In fact, you already have to play a move like rook h2 to not be a lot worse here as white. Or if they play bishop g2 to block, which is a more obvious move, then yeah, you go rook f8 and you start to get some play with, say, king to e1, queen to g1 check. This is quite an important move to force bishop f1 and then to play queen takes g from there. And okay, black is down a rook, but white is not really able to defend his king. And after queen to g1, you know, you're hitting the bishop, and the only way white can really sensibly cover it, you know, other than, you know, repeating moves with queen h4 and queen c4 back again, is king to e1, but then, you know, queen g3 is just a very obvious draw by repetition, as it were. So this is a way that the game could have ended on a correct kind of level, but instead black plays c5, and just the mistakes kind of accumulate to becoming quite significant. Such that after king g2, well, suddenly f5 is not really in time, because, well, you can simply play bishop c4, and, you know, just a big difference at fe4 is not so effective when the rook is opposite the king, yes or yes. So black goes a4, bishop c4 is played, and I mean, you also have to worry about things like the attack on the h-file against the king at some stage. So black goes a3, trying to give back the pawn to open up the b-file, but b3 just shuts it all down, and white just has complete control here. After queen e5, I'm really impressed with the move that Duda played at this point. He played the move queen at f4, and, you know, it might seem very counterintuitive to trade the queens when you're down a pawn, but the reality is that after the queens are traded, you know, this bishop is very passive. These rooks can't really be challenged on the d-file, and it's just a certain domination that gives white a very big advantage here. And the game concluded bishop h5, king to g3, so just building up the position. g6 is probably a mistake, but the alternative is just playing rook c8 and kind of just sitting and doing nothing, like shuffling back and forth, which is not an easy decision to make in time pressure. But the problem now is after rook d3 that this bishop is completely trapped and the pawn is covered, meaning that now white is ready to go king h4 and bring his king into the fight. And again, we can see the sheer domination in terms of the difference between the position of the kings, of the bishops, and of the rooks. And after rook h8, the way that white was able to convert his advantage was he played the move rook to c7. After the move rook c8, he then played the move rook to e7. So he kind of shuffled a little bit, you know, this didn't really change too much for the moment. But then after rook hf8, rook to c7, well, black decided not to play the move rook to c8 at this point. It is actually an interesting question, what is the winning plan for white if black does keep challenging the rook? And my feeling is it's probably going to be something like the move pawn to e5, where you're just going to kind of put black in a zugzwang of sorts, where it's like, well, you're ready to kind of go rook a7, put the rook on d7, and then you're either going to win this pawn this way. I'll play a couple of moves just so you see it on the board, like, say, rook a7, rook a8. And in a position like this, let's say if we trade the rooks and go rook d7, you can see that either you get in bishop e6 because of the pin, or you get in like king g8, king f6, or let's say if they defend with rook e8, you know, you have a very beautiful idea of playing f5, and, you know, you either get in this way, or fe6, or, you know, gf5, king h5, so very beautiful, almost study-like kind of concept for white here. And if they do play bishop f3, then, yeah, bishop e6, and still you've got the same domination. Yeah, like rook f8, you even have the move bishop f7, which is kind of the whole point of white's petite combinaison, that after rook f7, e6, that either you take the rook or they take your rook, but then you queen on the next move. So very beautiful and very, very instructive sequence, but instead Rapport played rook h8, and after rook h d7, rook hf8. Well, now white played f5 to even greater effect, and given that, well, taking with the e-pawn runs into rook f7 and just total domination on the king side, and gf5 would hang the bishop, and allowing fe6s may as well resign. This is why Rapport resigned in this position. So a very nice win for Duda, and definitely a good sign for his participation in upcoming candidates of June. Because I do think that at the moment, Duda might be one of the top 2 or 3 most difficult opponents for Magnus, so it would be quite interesting to see them battle in a World Championship match just for this reason. That stylistically, somehow Duda is very difficult for Magnus to deal with in some games. As you may recall from the 2021 World Cup, for example, where Duda crushed Carlsen in the rapid tiebreaks, and then went on to win the World Cup altogether by beating Kayakin in the final. So moving on to the next game I'd like to share is one between Vidit against Sam Shankland. This one that Vidit managed to win, so let's see how he did it. And yeah, Shankland decided not to play into a Nimzo Indian, which of course I did a very recent video on Nimzo Indian basic ideas. But instead he goes d5 and decides to play the exchange variation of the QGD instead. And because this game is a total of 73 moves long, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fast forward past the opening phase. You know, admittedly the move 98 by Shankland is a little bit of a creative attempt, saying that, well, in a lot of middle games, tonight is quite good on d6, so I don't mind maneuvering back. But I'm not sure if 98 is necessarily ideal in this exact position. I think that after this, like, one thing I noticed with Shanklin's course on chessball is at times he's, like, a little bit lazy and doesn't cover some important moves or go deeply enough. And I always assumed that, this was just because, he just wanted to make the course, like, kind of easy for the average club player to get through. But after looking at this game, like, maybe it's just, a sort of bad habit that his opening preparation is one of his weaknesses as a player. But anyway, this is just speculation. Because I think after 92 that White does have a pretty pleasant advantage, and, the knight would be very well placed on f4. And I mean, it's very easy to go for a minority attack from there, right? But anyway, the game went queen to f3. I guess trying to keep the tension in this way, which, I mean, does feel a little bit awkward, but it is a kind of creative attempt, I guess. Probably if I was black, I'd go knight d7 and try to get some play going on the queen side, or at least, playing against this. Maybe if it had intended some creative idea like g4 and trying to attack this way, but I don't think it should really amount to a serious advantage. Well, instead, Shanklin goes queen f6, just trying to trade off some pieces. But after 92, I think that the resulting middle game position is very much in White's favour, and after knight d6, there's nothing really wrong with just a move like castles here, but h4 was FIDE's choice to stop g5, and I think it's a very nice idea, because it also means in some lines you can also go g4, g5, and use the queen as a hook. And it's definitely a much more aggressive way to handle the queen's gambit as White compared to some other approaches, let's say, with short castle. Shanklin defended quite well. He played bishop to f5, wanting to trade some pieces. After bishop takes f5 in turn, it might be more precise to play the move knight takes f5, but it kind of doesn't really make a difference. Like, in the game, it ends up just transposing anyway after queen f5. g4, queen f6. I skipped that a little bit there. g5 was played, queen f5, and I guess that Vidit realized that his attack is maybe slowing down a little bit. The Indian wants to go knight c2, but after 94, I mean, black is reasonably solid here. White's edge is definitely kept within manageable bounds, let's say. And, knight a6, black can try to get some counterplay on the king side as well. So it would keep white to a small edge. So Vidit decides to go queen a3 and just force the queens off the board, trusting his ability to outplay his opponent in a very marginally better endgame. And, well, he ultimately managed to do so after many adventures. b3 stops any knight c4 ideas. 94 maybe is trying a little bit too hard to force the play. I think that a move like knight f8 and just holding back h5, g6 and being a bit more patient might have been a better path toward equality, because the knight on east d6 also does a very good job at making sure there's not going to be any minority attack with b4, b5, because then the knight can go to c4. So that's the reason why I think knight e4 is probably not the best move in the position, to say the least. And if you do play d4, it's kind of like, so what? Like, the space doesn't really matter that much at this point. I can still go h5 and still try to hit or create some weaknesses on the king side. g6 in particular being quite an annoying way to break up the structure. So black goes rook takes e4. We have king d2, and I think that white is just significantly better here. Because black just doesn't really have a good pawn break, and, well, Shanklin, having written 2 books on pawn structure, understands this as well as anybody, but somehow, yeah, it's just not so pleasant. I'm not so sure about the next moves, like knight e2 and knight g3. I'm not sure if you're really achieving that much with this knight maneuver, to be honest. But it's also a position where the structure, I guess, is kind of going to be the same as in general. Though I guess given time, black could maybe go a5 and knight b6, and, he could try to reroute the knight to d6 and cover white's main breaks if white were to be a little bit too slow, which is one reason I'm not a big fan of, like, this knight e2, knight g3 maneuver, as it were. But in the game, it kind of worked out, because this g6, I think, was a slightly unforced loosening move. After h5, white's got a little bit of a hook here. Okay, it is true you are covering the knight, and, well, Shanklin kind of was able to justify his g6 move in the game with c5, which I think is quite an important move to make this idea work. Because you got to have some sort of counterplay so that this doesn't become a problem. Well, white starts to play rook h1 anyway. I mean, I would have gone rook h4 and tried to take back with a piece. Because I think that this ending after take and knight f8 is just totally equal. I mean, structure is symmetrical, and yeah, the pawn might be back on h7, but with a knight f8, it's kind of like, so what? Position is just very, very balanced. But instead, we have rook a7, rook c1. I'm going to fast forward a little bit here. I mean, again, knight e2 and taking back with a piece is quite important to saddle black with the IQP as such. But for whatever reason, the players decide not to go down this path. Again, maybe time trouble was a factor, because I think otherwise this sort of thing would normally be well within a 700 plus players understanding. But anyway, knight to f5. Well, f8 was played, rook c5, so white is trying to be a bit annoying. Actually, computer points out a very fun idea. But it's not easy to see, but it's kind of a fun point that a move like f5. It's possible that, on passant you go take and rook f2 ideas. But if rook f5, d5, you get f4, and suddenly you get rook e2 and you get the pawn back. It's a very hard move to consider because the automatic knee-jerk action is just defend the pawn and it's fine. But it sort of shows the advantage of looking for alternatives in position. But okay, rook d6, I mean, this is not the reason that black lost the game. But it does mean that black's under a little bit more pressure than perhaps was necessary. So we have rook e d7. Black is playing very passively, and this does make his life a bit more difficult, compared to some more active attempts, let's say, to attack white's pawns. And I mean, here you probably need to play some move like f6 and at least try to trade some pawns to, try to get at white's weaknesses as well. You don't really want to let white have control here if you can help it. But I think that Shankland somewhat underestimated the strategic dangers of the position when he played rook d8, because now after take knight f4, I mean, suddenly this pawn is quite weak, and, if white is able to, let's say, switch the rook over, there could be some quite real problems. Black played a move f6, and unfortunately, I don't think this really works out. I mean, the idea strategically makes sense that, if you're able to trade off these pawns, it's great to do so, because then white's pawn and remaining pawns are isolated, but here you probably have to cut your losses and play something like g takes h5, which, okay, I get is a very difficult move to play from a human perspective to voluntarily weaken your structure. But the point is that after knight e6, his pawns are actually as weak as your pawns. Yeah, knight f6 can come, but it's kind of like, so what? You take my pawn, I take your pawn afterwards. But after f6, white is able to take, and ultimately here, after king f7, I think what Shankland had overlooked is that after takes, that white has a powerful retreat, and by the way, you're welcome to try to find it as well, because without this move, black would probably be surviving. But as it stands, the move that is incredibly strong here is the maneuver knight to d3. With the idea of putting knight on e5, and in the game after knight f6, king f6 rather, white indeed did play knight e5. Okay, it turns out, actually he didn't play knight e5, he played an even better move. He played rook f3 first, little intermediate check, and then he played the move of knight e5, threatening rook f7. And it's hard to deal with it, right? Because after king e6, I mean, you can still play rook f7 anyway, it turns out. Which for some reason FIDE decided not to play. And I'm trying to figure out why he decided not to do this, because, I mean, rook b8 is such a horribly passive move, but I'm guessing he's worried about knight d7 or something. But in this case, I think the pawn ending is just a very clear win, though, yeah? You go king e6, e3. And after king f4, king f6, I mean, black is just eventually going to run out of pawn moves here, because let's say you play b4, for example, just, play a move to kind of wait to see what black does. If black goes g5 at some point, that's not going to cut it, because after king g4, king g6, I guess f4, and, at some point, black is going to run out of pawn moves. Let's say b5 and, a6 is kind of like, okay, just take, and a3, and, you're going to have to give way first with your king there. Or if b6, like, obviously you're running out of time there, yes or yes. And, the king just kind of ekes its way in, and, with a little outflanking will eventually win the d5 pawn and win the game, yes or yes. And if black, let's say, doesn't play g5 and plays, let's say, b5 instead, or, some other move, the thing is, it doesn't really matter whether, it's going to be white's king to move or black's king to move, because, you can even play king g4 and kind of just, wait for him to run out of pawn moves in a certain sense. Let's say, like, you can even play f4, actually, if you want to, and just, make sure that your king is going to get to g5, that you trade with f5, and, pick off the pawns and win. It's not that complicated. So I'm guessing it was only because of some severe time trouble that FIDE didn't play the move rook f7. In the end, he played a4, which could have allowed black to potentially try to get back in the game a little bit. But in the end, it was still ultimately a decisive advantage. And, once FIDE did play this move of rook to f7 at this point on move 41, then he did go on to win. It was g5, rook g7, king f5, king to e3, and, well, at some point, black just ran out of moves. After b6, king f3, there's suddenly the quite real problem that white has, some threats here, like, well, one example is even just rook f7 and king g4 to pick off the pawn. And Shankland's g4 didn't really help that much, because after take and knight e6, it turns out that black is actually not winning back the pawn because of the intermediate check knight e3. And then it turned out later on he even managed to win a second pawn with b5, knight d5. And okay, I think most of you know how to win with 2 extra pawns white. And indeed, Vidit did go on to win from this position in another 22 moves, which I'm not going to show because otherwise the video will be too long, but you get the idea. So I have one more game that I would like to share with you. This one was a 44-move win by the reigning champion of Tata Steel 2021, Jordan van Foreest, who you may recall defeated Anish Giri in a playoff last year in Tata Steel. And in this game, he managed to beat Nils Grandelius in a Roy Lopez. It's kind of funny because actually, I remember last year, Grandelius actually rode a course on the Roy Lopez for white on Chessable, but yeah, here he kind of got a taste of his own medicine. Where with the move d3, it's a way to kind of avoid certain systems such as, let's say, knight takes e4 and the open Spanish is the main thing you're trying to avoid in this case. And maybe it'll also give you some extra options in some different lines. But of course, when you play d3 so early, you also give black extra options. For example, moves like bishop c5 are more effective when you're not worrying about the bishop getting kicked with c3 and d4 in one go. And the other major independent option black gets is the move d6 and playing it in a Steinitz style with g6, because let's say black plays d6 here, it's not as good because white can go c3, d4 in one go. But in this version, it's going to take an extra tempo, and white's slower sub really allows black to justify this sub as a very serious way to play for equality. So we had rook e1, castles, knight bd2, this is all pretty standard. Of course, you can play h3, but they often will transpose. But in the game, Van Foreest tries to benefit from not playing the move h3, and instead plays the move knight f1, kind of going for a very standard Lopez maneuver to get the knight out of the way of the other pieces, yeah? The game went b5, kicking the bishop, and here we see another advantage, actually, of playing the move d3, c3, instead of, like, delaying it for a long time. Because if black had played b5 much earlier, you would only have this b3 square to go to with the bishop. But because black has waited a bit to play b5, and because we played d3, c3 a bit early, it means we can now bring the bishop back to c2 in one go, so they're not able to go like knight a5, c5, and go for a Chigorin style setup, which is generally considered quite fine for black here. Incidentally, instead of b5, maybe a better try is just to play more patiently, like h6 and, you know, stop bishop g5 and keep the option to play for d5 in the center, maybe with b5 and then d5. And I think that that would give black very close to full equality if he does this, just very solid position with a bishop on g7, because in a lot of the close Spanish lines, you'll see black doing a maneuver like bishop e7, bishop f8, g6, bishop g7. But here we did a lot more quickly, right? So it does make a difference. But after b5, black goes for this move of a5, which I'm, not sure if this is really the best way to play. It's probably not a terrible move, granted, but yeah, a5, I mean, you are opening yourself up to some a4, but I guess b4 and hitting this pawn is kind of the idea of black's play. White decides to go bishop g5 instead, which it's not a move I'm in love with, but it's not a horrible move by any means either. Like, it's certainly, with such a move, we can feel the influence of Van Foreest working on Magnus Carlsen's team for the 2021 World Championship match with Nepo, because Carlsen also had this predilection for playing this bishop g5 h4, even in the positions where the computer is not so enthusiastic about the idea. So Grandelius has played the opening well. I think after a4 we can say that, you know, the position is about equal, with black's queenside space making up for white potentially being able to go for d4 and push into center. Black plays bishop to b7, and it's a very subtle point, but maybe d7 might be a better square for the bishop. But of course, the reason is something I think only a computer would really understand on a surface level. As it is, of course, bishop b7, there's nothing terribly wrong with the move itself, but maybe a slight imprecision. I mean, a move like b3 would be kind of interesting, actually, just trying to, you know, open up the diagonal for the bishop again, but okay, the game instead saw c4, trying to create some tension and say the a-pawn could potentially be a weakness. And in turn, black probably didn't handle this in the best way. If I was playing as black, I would probably play either the move bishop a6, just keeping the tension and making sure that pawn stays defended, and I think that would give equality with some knight d4 and, you know, using the fact that c4 does weaken some squares as well. Or you could also just play b takes c4 and just trade the pawns, and, you know, if white does play, let's say, bishop takes f6 and bishop a4, it's kind of like, well, so what? I can play, you know, the move of cd3 and, you know, the pin might look annoying, but this pawn is also kind of annoying, right? In fact, if white goes rook c1, there's a very beautiful exchange sack idea where you can play take, take, and now the move knight to d4. where you're trying to get rid of this knight to go d2 forking the rooks. Okay, very advanced, very computer-like, but it shows the dynamic potential of black's position when you've got the double fianchetto like this. But after knight b4, unfortunately, it's probably not the best execution of this idea. And now, after the move cb5 that was played in the game, I think that white is just better. For some reason, computer wants to throw in bishop f6 first so that you're not having to worry about g5. But in the game, after queen d7, we kind of get a similar thing anyway, with bishop f6. And yeah, now I'm a little bit surprised, actually, that Grandelius didn't play knight c2 and at least, cut the losses to a pawn at this point. Instead, what he did was white is probably still better here. Like, you've got rook e1 who hitting this, but the bishops at least give some compensation for the pawn. Not enough, but at least it's something. But after bishop f6, white now plays the move bishop a4, and, well, Grandelius was counting on the move knight takes d3, and perhaps his belief when calculating this from afar, when he played knight b4, is that, well, I'm attacking the pawn on e4, and if white defends, I go rook b4 and I get the pawn back, so my position is therefore very good. The problem with this is that Van Voorhees found a very, very nice retreat. Knight d5 might look obvious, but then black goes bishop d5 and gets his pawn back and basically survives. But the move knight d1 played by Van Voorhees is a different story. And the idea is that after rook b4 and now the move of a4 is what was played in the game, which, funnily enough, actually a4 is not the most precise. The computer actually prefers to actually give back the pawn with knight c3, but then to go a4 and say that the rook is a little bit stuck. You have like knight d2, knight c4, and you can try to potentially win the exchange. Or at the very least have that rook be very, very passive, because definitely that a pawn is a real menace in such a position. But okay, in the game, Van Voorhees was more materialistic, playing a4. The reason this is a little bit less precise is because of the move that Grandelius played with the move d5, and I think we all know Grandelius to be a very, very tricky and resourceful player, and he really shows that, realizing that, if white plays ed5, that the sort of martial-like compensation black gets is ending with the bishops would allow him to probably hold the draw with decent play. I mean, white is a little better, but it's nothing too special at the moment when the knight is so passive and the rook is so passive. So white goes queen d2, hitting the rook instead. And after queen d6 and ed5, well, we see the point of flicking in these moves is that there's no queen takes d5 because the rook is hanging, yeah? But black does get other ideas. I mean, if you play bishop d5, white will go knight e3 and say that, well, the threat of trading means we can trade the queens and get our pawns moving, which, can be a little bit scary looking, even if it's not, game over per se for black. Black decides instead to go e4 and try to, mix up the position, make it kind of messy, which is actually quite a good move, I think, in this position. So after queen h6, here is where I think black's next move is sort of where the game turns from being sort of okay-ish for black to being just not really that great. So what black should have done here is he should have played the simple queen takes pawn. Okay, you're not threatening to take the knight because of the pin, but on the other hand, you also have ideas like bishop g7 to kick the queen out. Even moves like queen h5 potentially. Like, say, if knight e3 is played, for example, then, yeah, here you could just play queen at d8, actually, and, knight g4, bishop g7. It's like, well, where is white going with this, yeah? After queen f4, yeah, you stop df3 because of the pin, but queen e7, and we see that, white is lacking a little bit of coordination here. Knight g5, f5, black is going to get one of the pawns back. And once you get one pawn back and you've got some play with the bishops and with the strong center, I think that this is absolutely full compensation for black. Well, it reminds me of some special compositions I used to play as a little kid. But I digress. But after queen f8, the difference is that now it just doesn't work as well. After take knight d2, black can take one of the pawns back. But then white is sort of getting his knights to good blockading positions. And after bishop to d5, it turns out knight c3 is actually a really good move, where you just are able to attack the bishop and attack the pawn in a nice way. And black isn't able to play rook takes b2 in time, because then as you can see, the bishop on f6 is on pre at the end of this line, yeah? But white goes rook e3 instead, and okay, it's not as precise. Black now has to move bishop d4, and so we see, I guess, a little bit of a difference in class between, let's say, a just 2 700-ish player versus, like, the 2 800 or nearly 2 800 guys. But still, we have to commend Van Voorhees for his fighting spirit, and it ultimately, he was rewarded with a win for it in the end. As after f5, for this point, both players were playing quite well. G3 holds back f4. G5 is a very important move to renew this idea of pushing that pawn and getting those bishops coming to life. Because if you get an F4 and E3, that white king is actually pretty exposed right now. And now, very nice move by Van Foreest, knight E3, kind of realizing it, okay, I'm not really better anymore, so let's just liquidate and maintain the balance. Probably the simplest way to play is just to go rook b2 and just, let them take the bishop, but in turn you also get to, have pressure against f2, and again, you get compensation for the pawn here. In fact, quite full compensation. So instead, though, black goes bishop e3, and he tries to grab a pawn this way. And technically, it's still holding, but you have to work a bit harder in this line. Because knight f1, saying these pawns are doing a good job of holding these guys back. And so black is really dependent on his piece activity to make it work. And I guess that time trouble again might have been a factor, because Grandelius did not realize that he has to play the move rook a8 at this point. Well, has to is a bit strong. There are some other moves that exist, but rook a8 is kind of nice because you are not letting white get out of this sort of pin with the rooks. Like, if you play rook c1 or rook c3, black is going to play rook b5 and sort of get rid of the pawn, and okay, white can try to win the pawn of rook c7, but black goes rook b3, and, somehow white's pieces are just too passive, and it just ends up being a draw. Black will bring the king up, get his pawn back, and it's just ironclad draw. You can take my word for it, or more precise, you can take Stockfish's word for it. But instead, bishop c4 is kind of the mistake where things start to shift. Actually, it turns out to be a decisive mistake, because now the difference is rook c3 comes with a tempo. And, black is not in time to, do some tactic on b5 that would have been possible, with the rook on a8. So a big difference here, and after bishop e2, rook ac1 is again a very important move, because you really want to be able to meet bishop f3 with rook c2, stopping rook g2 and allowing you to still keep up your threats against their position, as it were. And also note that bishop on f3 is a little bit impish when you don't have the rook to back up the attack. The game went rook to a8 instead, and once more bishop rook c2, very, very important and very precise move, where we trade off the invading rook so that we can consolidate and keep the attack. And by the way, the rook ending is not holding for black, as after rook takes a4, it turns out that after rook c7 that you're just going to go rook c5, collect here, and white just wins, basically, with 2 extra pawns. Instead, the game saw bishop f3, rook c4 just keeps being defended, and now it was just a matter of technique. Grandelius tried king e7, sacrificing a second pawn to at least get some activity with the king. Unfortunately, with no real weakness in the white position, it just doesn't really amount to anything. And the game ended bishop e2, rook to b4, rook c8, knight d2, just getting out of any rook c1 pins. Bishop d3 is played, b6, and now the white pawn is just too fast. And after rook c2, b7. At this point, Grandelius resigned, as after rook takes d2, we see that very quickly the black checks peter out after king e1, rook e2, king d1, and white queen's next move, yeah? So that concludes my round 1 recap for the Tata Steel Masters. Obviously, if I was covering the challenges as well, this would be like 2.5 hours, but I think this is a good moment to conclude and to show, A, that other players do blow winning positions, so don't beat yourself up if you get a winning position at some point but you didn't win the game. And B, we also learn a lot from that, because we learn what to do instead, how we should approach these situations, and how to calculate accurately, so that we can in fact turn our decisive advantage into wins the way that the players Duda, Vidit, and Van Foreest managed to do in order to be equal for lead after 1 round on 1 out of 1. So I suppose that round 2 will sort out the boys from the men in terms of who takes the outright lead, or whether they'll just be a traffic jam of plays on 1.5 out of 2, but we will find out soon enough. In any case, glad you enjoyed this video. Also make sure to leave a comment below with what your favourite game or favourite moment was from this video, because I love to hear from you guys as well. And I will see you in the next one. As for these reports, I mean, I'll see like how many people watch this. Like if, nobody watches this, probably I want to do like more recaps, but if we have like a few, let's say, stalwarts who, watch the whole thing and, really enjoy it, then it can be more of a series. Anyway, I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.